I found footprints leading into my basement wall, and they don't stop at the surface. These impossible geometries suggest someone walked through wet cement that was already 80 years dry. We're tearing down the foundation today because the slapping sounds behind the stone are getting louder and the humidity is rising. That sentence still feels wrong every time I say it out loud. Not dramatic, not exaggerated for effect, just wrong. The way a human body reacts to information it cannot file anywhere rational. My name is Daniel Voss, and I have spent 11 years investigating structural anomalies in residential properties across the Northeast. I have seen foundation heave from frost. I have seen water pressure carve channels through poured concrete that looked like deliberate sculpture. I have seen houses do things to themselves that took teams of engineers months to explain. Nothing in those 11 years prepared me for the morning I carried my humidity meter into the basement of the Hartwell property and found that someone or something had been walking through the walls. The Hartwell house sits on the edge of a former mill district in western Pennsylvania. Built in 1943, it is the kind of structure that was meant to last. Thick, load-bearing concrete walls, a poured foundation nearly 3 feet deep in some sections, limestone aggregate sourced from a local quarry that has since been closed. The couple who owned it, Owen and Petra Hartwell, had purchased it 6 years prior and had never once descended to the basement without feeling uneasy. Petra described it as a pressure behind the ears, like the room was louder than it had any right to be. Owen called it simpler than that. He said it always felt occupied. They called me because of the sounds. The sounds started in late autumn when the air outside cooled and the moisture inside the walls had nowhere to escape. A rhythmic, wet slap, regular as a metronome, organic as a heartbeat, emanating from somewhere inside the structural load-bearing wall along the home's northern foundation. They had already called a plumber, who found no pipes behind the wall. They had called an exterminator, who found no evidence of nesting or infestation. They had called a general contractor, who looked at the wall for 45 seconds, said he didn't like it, and never sent his invoice. I brought my standard kit, a humidity data logger, a contact microphone array, and a handheld thermal camera. I also brought, almost as an afterthought, a LiDAR scanning unit I had recently borrowed from a university geology department. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, fires thousands of laser pulses per second and constructs a three-dimensional point cloud of any surface it is aimed at. I had used it to document crack propagation in old bridge abutments. I had never thought to use it on a basement floor until I descended the Hartwell stairs and saw the footprints. They were visible to the naked eye, a sequence of barefoot impressions beginning in the center of the concrete floor, crossing toward the northern wall and disappearing directly into the stone surface. My first rational instinct was pareidolia, the human brain assembling meaningful shapes from random texture variation. Old concrete is full of variation. It settles unevenly, aggregates shift, surface water leaves ghost marks for decades. I crouched down and ran my fingers across the nearest impression. The heel depression was a full 1.5 centimeters below the surrounding floor surface. The toe spread was anatomically precise, with individual digit pressure points that no settling pattern could replicate. The surface of the impression was smooth, as if polished from within. Whatever had made it, had pressed down with significant body weight into material that had been cured rock solid since before the Second World War ended. I set up the LiDAR unit and ran a full sweep of the floor. The point cloud rendered in real time on my laptop screen, and I sat there in the blue-white light of the display and felt the first genuine chill I had experienced on a job site in years. The prints were not surface marks. They were not shadows or discoloration or the ghost residue of a construction worker's boot from the original pour. They were full volumetric depressions, averaging 31 millimeters in depth at the heel and 18 at the ball of the foot. The geometry was unmistakable. A human adult, likely between 150 and 180 pounds, walking at a moderate pace in bare feet, walking directly and without hesitation into 80 years of cured solid stone. There were 11 complete footfall pairs. The stride length was consistent, roughly 72 centimeters, suggesting unhurried movement. No stumble, no drag, no variation in pressure distribution that would indicate distress or urgency. Whoever or whatever had made these impressions had walked into that wall the same way you walk into a room you have entered 1,000 times before. And then the humidity sensor crossed 60%. I heard it before I consciously registered what it was. A wet, rhythmic slap, not loud but resonant, the way a sound is when it is traveled through dense material before reaching you. 1, then silence. 2, then silence. The interval was approximately 1 second, the same cadence as the stride length encoded in the concrete beneath my feet. I pressed my palm flat against the northern wall. The stone was cool and completely still, the way all old walls are still, inert, indifferent, permanent. But the sound was coming from inside it. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say inside, not from behind the wall, as in a hidden corridor or a crawl space the blueprints had failed to account for. The contact microphone I pressed against the concrete surface registered the vibration as originating within the material itself, from somewhere between the outer face of the wall and what the original construction documents described as a solid limestone core aggregate. I stood in that basement for a long time, listening to the rhythm, watching the humidity meter climb, looking at the impossible roadmap of footprints laid into the concrete like a message written in a language I almost recognized. Owen Hartwell came downstairs to check on me around 2 in the afternoon. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, looked at my equipment, looked at the wall, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "It's louder than it was last week." And he was right, and I had only been there for 4 hours. Whatever was inside that wall, whatever had pressed 11 pairs of footprints into 80-year-old cured stone from some direction physics couldn't account for, it was not slowing down. It was building to something. That thought kept returning to me as I drove back to my hotel that night, the LiDAR data open on the passenger seat, the point cloud rendering those precise, deliberate impressions over and over in the glow of the display. 11 footfalls, 72 centimeters of stride, 180 degrees of departure from any rational framework I had ever operated inside. The prints weren't leading into the wall. I wouldn't understand what that meant until the foundation came apart in my hands. There's a specific kind of dread that arrives not with a sudden shock, but with accumulating precision. It is the dread of data that keeps confirming what you hoped it would disprove. I spent the following morning reviewing the previous day's humidity logs, contact microphone readings, and LiDAR rendering, constructing a timeline and looking with mounting desperation for the error, the variable I had miscalibrated, the sensor interference, the mundane explanation hiding in plain sight behind the numbers. The numbers would not cooperate. I returned to the Hartwell basement at 7 in the morning with a directional microphone array, 3 highly sensitive parabolic units arranged in a triangular configuration, capable of isolating a sound source within a few centimeters in 3-dimensional space. The kind of equipment used for acoustic research, for wildlife monitoring in dense forest, for tracking structural resonance in large civil engineering projects. I had never used it to locate something moving inside solid concrete. The idea would have seemed absurd to me 48 hours earlier. The ambient humidity in the basement was already sitting at 58%, 2 points below the threshold. I set up the array facing the northern wall and ran calibration tones, mapping the acoustic profile of the room before any anomalous sound began. Every space has a voice, its own resonant frequencies shaped by its dimensions, materials, and the way sound energy moves and dies within it. The Hartwell basement's baseline was dense and muffled, as you would expect from a room wrapped in several feet of old concrete. Sound didn't travel cleanly in there. It absorbed. At 9:47, the humidity crossed 60%. The slapping sound began within 90 seconds of the threshold crossing. 3 parabolic microphones swiveled in response to the acoustic signal, and the triangulation software rendered a live 3-dimensional coordinate on my display. The source point was not behind the wall, not beneath the floor, not above the ceiling. It was located 31 centimeters inside the material of the load-bearing wall itself, positioned directly above the vanishing point where the concrete footprints crossed the surface and ceased to exist. I ran the triangulation 3 times. The coordinate shifted by less than 2 centimeters across all 3 measurements. The source sound was stationary. It was not moving through the wall. It was emanating from a fixed point within it. But the rhythm was unmistakably ambulatory. 1, pause, 2, pause. The wet percussion of a heel striking a hard surface, followed by the forward roll of weight onto a ball of foot. A walking gait, captured in sound, produced by something that was apparently standing still. This is where I want you to stop and hold that contradiction for a moment, because it is the detail that broke every framework I reached for over the following hours. A walking rhythm requires displacement. Feet must lift and fall. Weight must transfer. A body must move through space. What the acoustic data showed me was a walking sound produced with no lateral movement whatsoever, as if something had been frozen mid-stride inside the concrete, not dead, not dormant, but endlessly cycling through the biomechanical sequence of a single footfall, locked in place, going nowhere. I pulled out the thermal imaging camera next and swept it slowly across the northern wall's surface. Thermal imaging reads surface temperature variation, and old concrete walls are predictably boring in thermal terms. They hold temperature evenly, their mass too great to respond quickly to ambient fluctuations. The Hartwell wall was, accordingly, a uniform blue-gray wash across my display, except for one section, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, centered directly over the coordinates the acoustic array had identified. It was cold, distinctly, measurably colder than the surrounding material, a 7-degree differential on a surface that had no business having any differential at all. And the shape of the cold zone was not a rectangle, not an oval, not any of the geometric forms you might expect from a void or a thermal bridge or a trapped pocket of cooler air. It was a human silhouette. I am disciplined about avoiding premature conclusions on job sites. I have built a professional reputation on that discipline. So I will tell you exactly what the thermal camera showed in factual terms without editorializing. There was a region of depressed surface temperature on the northern load-bearing wall of the Hartwell basement. That region was approximately 175 centimeters tall and roughly 50 centimeters wide at the shoulder, narrowing at the waist and expanding slightly at the hips. It had bilateral symmetry. At its base, 2 smaller cold regions extended downward at angles consistent with a standing figure's feet. The coldest point in the image, the deepest blue on my display, was located at the approximate position of the figure's face. I held the thermal camera steady for a long time. The shape didn't move. The humidity sensor climbed another half point. The slapping rhythm continued from inside the wall, 1 per second, the same cadence it had maintained since the previous afternoon. I thought about the stride length encoded in the concrete floor, 72 centimeters. I thought about the uniformity of pressure distribution across all 11 footfalls. I thought about the biological precision of the toe and heel impressions that the LiDAR had rendered in pitiless detail. And then I ran a measurement I had not thought to run until that moment. I pulled up the LiDAR floor scan and measured the distance between the last footprint before the wall and the surface of the wall itself. 12 centimeters, an incomplete stride, as if the person, if we can call it that, had been mid-step when they passed through, foot already rising, weight already transferring forward. Mid-step, still in motion, preserved at the moment of crossing. The acoustic data showed a rhythm consistent with a walking gait. The thermal data showed a figure standing at the wall's interior surface. If both data sets were accurate, something was walking in place inside 31 centimeters of 80-year-old concrete, burning cold instead of warm, pressing the same heel strike over and over into stone it had already passed through once. I sat on the basement floor and pulled up the chronological acoustic record from the previous day. The sound was not continuous. It occurred in discrete sessions, always following the humidity crossing 60%, always at the same rhythm, always from the same point source. But the sessions were lengthening. The first session the previous afternoon had lasted 11 minutes. The second, 2 hours later, had lasted 19 minutes. The overnight session, which I had set the contact microphones to record automatically, had lasted 34 minutes. That morning session, now 37 minutes old, showed no sign of stopping. Whatever was pacing in that wall was gaining endurance, or gaining something that functioned like endurance, some form of accumulating capacity that correlated with time, with humidity, with the slow erosion of whatever boundary had been holding it in the first place. I called Owen Hartwell upstairs and told him we needed to talk about opening the wall. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had been waiting years for someone to say exactly those words, and the relief on his face was immediately complicated by something else, a recognition, I think, that once you open certain walls, you cannot close them again. Not the concrete ones, not the other kind either. "How soon?" he asked. I looked at the humidity sensor, 62% and climbing. "Soon," I said. "Before it gets louder. The diamond blade concrete saw arrived the following morning on a flatbed truck operated by a structural demolition contractor named Ray Paulus, who had spent 30 years cutting through everything from post-tension slabs to reinforced retaining walls. I had worked with Ray twice before. He was phlegmatic, unhurried, and deeply unimpressed by most things. He walked into the Hartwell basement, looked at the northern wall, and was quiet for a moment longer than I expected. "What's the smell?" he said. I had stopped noticing it, which in retrospect is its own kind of warning sign. The basement carried a particular odor that I had initially attributed to old concrete, mineral dust, the general sealed-off atmosphere of a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in decades. Ray, coming in fresh, identified it immediately as something distinct. Not mold, not rot, not the sulfurous note of active groundwater intrusion. He described it as mineral and wet, like stone after a heavy rain. Petrogor, but heavier, more interior, as if the rain had fallen somewhere deep underground and the scent had taken years to surface. The humidity was sitting at 59%, 1 point below the threshold. The slapping sound was absent, and its absence felt deliberate, as if something had gone very still upon sensing our intentions. Ray made his cuts in a precise rectangular section of the outer wall face, 40 centimeters wide and 60 tall, centered on the triangulated acoustic coordinate. The diamond blade moved through the concrete with a sound like sustained screaming, high, ceramic, total. Petra Hartwell had gone to stay with her sister for the duration. Owen sat at the top of the basement stairs and did not come down. The cut section came free in 2 pieces. Ray set them on the floor and stepped back, and we both looked at what the outer concrete layer had been concealing. The internal aggregate of the Hartwell wall was not what the original construction documents described. Those documents specified a mixture of local limestone gravel, Portland cement, and river sand, standard 1940s residential construction. What we found in the exposed core was all of those things, but displaced. The aggregate had been pushed aside in 2 distinct channels, each roughly 14 centimeters wide, each running vertically through the exposed section of wall. The channels were smooth-sided, as if the stone had flowed away from something passing through it and then frozen in that position. The cement matrix between the displaced aggregate showed no cracking, no fracture lines, no evidence of the kind of mechanical force that would be required to physically move embedded aggregate after curing. It looked like 2 columns of water had passed through solid rock, and the rock had simply parted for them. The channels were exactly 72 centimeters apart, the same as the stride length encoded in the basement floor. I measured them 3 times because my hands were not entirely steady, and I wanted to be sure the tape was reading correctly. 72 centimeters, 2 channels, the geometry of a walking gait, preserved in displaced concrete aggregate like a fossil of motion. Ray looked at the measurement tape, looked at the channels, and said nothing for a while. Then, "I've been in a lot of walls, never seen aggregate move like that without rebar or a void." "There's no rebar in this section?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "This part of the wall was just poured solid." I reached into the left channel, the one corresponding to the left foot if the geometry of gait held, and ran my fingers along the smooth inner surface. The concrete there was unbroken, uniform, without the granular texture of the surrounding aggregate. It felt almost vitrified, as if the material had been briefly subjected to extreme heat and then cooled rapidly. But the temperature data showed the opposite. The coldest point in the wall was precisely where we had cut. And then I noticed the moisture. Not condensation, not the surface water you find when cold concrete meets warm, humid air. This was coming from within the channels themselves, beading on the smooth inner surface and running slowly downward. I collected a sample in a sterile vial and sent it to the environmental lab I use for groundwater analysis. The results would take us several days, but the preliminary field test I ran on site was immediately strange. The water's conductivity reading was inconsistent with municipal water, local groundwater, or any pipe leakage source. Its mineral content was anomalously high in calcium and magnesium carbonate, the signature of water that had been in contact with limestone for an extended period, possibly centuries. The water inside those channels was old. Not old the way a sealed pipe is old the way an aquifer is old, the way underground water is old when it has been moving through bedrock since before the house existed, since before the street existed, since before anyone thought to build anything here at all. I took the thermal camera to the exposed cavity and swept it across the interior surface. The cold silhouette that had been visible through the outer concrete face was now, with the outer layer removed, measurably stronger. The temperature differential had widened from 7 degrees to 11. The shape was clearer too, closer, as if removing 30 centimeters of stone had brought us 30 centimeters nearer to something that was maintaining a specific distance from the surface. Not hiding, waiting. There is a difference, and that afternoon I understood it for the first time. The humidity sensor climbed past 60% at 2:14 in the afternoon. The slapping sound began immediately, not from within the wall as before, but from the exposed cavity interior, resonant and close. Ray took one large step backward without saying anything. I held the contact microphone against the smooth inner surface of the left foot channel and listened through headphones to the sound as it transmitted through the stone. It was wet, it was rhythmic, and underneath the primary slap of heel strike, there was something I had not detected through the full thickness of the outer wall. A secondary sound, lower in frequency, occurring approximately once in every 4 or 5 primary beats. Not a footfall, something else. A slower percussion, heavier, resonant in a way that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere in the chest. Like a knock, patient, deliberate, and directed outward. Whatever was on the other side of that wall had noticed we were getting closer, and it was responding in the only way available to it, by pressing harder against the boundary between us. I pulled the headphones off and told Ray we were done for the day. He didn't argue. The structural historian's name was Dr. Annalise Varden, and she had spent 20 years documenting the architectural evolution of Mill District properties across western Pennsylvania. I reached her by phone the evening after we opened the wall and described what we had found. There was a pause on the line after I finished speaking, not the pause of skepticism, but the pause of someone sorting through a filing system in their head, pulling references. "The Hartwell property," she said, "on Graber Mill Road. You know it?" "I know what was there before it," she said. "Can I come tomorrow?" She arrived with 3 rolled architectural surveys and a cardboard folder of photocopied documents from the county deed office. We spread them across a folding table in the Hartwell living room, and she oriented herself to the current floor plan before unrolling the oldest survey, a hand-drawn site map dated 1911, 32 years before the house was built. The survey showed no residential structure on the property. What it showed was a limestone quarry operation, small-scale, family-owned, worked intermittently through the late 19th century. The quarry pit itself was located, Dr. Varden traced it with her finger, approximately where the northern half of the Hartwell basement now sat. The quarry was partially backfilled when the property sold in 1942, she said. Standard practice for the era. They would have packed the pit with excavated material, poured new concrete over the top, and called it a stable foundation. Which means the basement floor we've been walking on is sitting directly above the original quarry bed. Yes. She pulled out a second document, a geological survey from 1938. There's a limestone vein running diagonally through this property. It was the reason the quarry operated here. Good quality limestone, easy to access. It runs northeast to southwest, which on the current building's orientation would mean, she looked up at me. It runs directly under the northern load-bearing wall. I spread the LiDAR floor scan on the table beside her documents and overlaid the footprint trajectory. The prints cross the basement floor from south to north, consistent with someone walking from the interior of the space toward the wall. But with the limestone vein map beneath it, the direction resolved into something more specific. The prints weren't aimed randomly at the wall. They followed the precise northeast bearing of the underlying limestone vein, as if whatever made them was navigating not by the floor plan of the house, but by the geological features buried beneath it. Following a road that existed long before the house was built, long before the concrete was poured, long before anyone thought to call this property anything. Dr. Varden examined the LiDAR data with the attention of someone reading a text in a language they had studied for a long time. She measured stride lengths, noted the pressure distribution, compared the bearing of the path against her geological survey. "The prints are following the vein," she said quietly. "Not approximately, exactly, to within a degree." The crystallization was the final piece she helped me understand. During my examination of the exposed wall cavity the previous day, I had photographed a mineral formation visible inside the deeper heel strike channels, a pale, translucent crust developing on the smooth inner concrete surface, concentrated most heavily at the lowest point of each depression. Under a field loop, it had a faintly fibrous structure, the crystals growing in radiating clusters rather than the blocky form I associated with common calcium carbonate precipitation. I sent the photographs to a mineralogist at the State University. Her response arrived that evening. The crystal morphology was consistent with aragonite, a calcium carbonate polymorph that forms under specific pressure and temperature conditions and is commonly found in cave systems associated with active water flow through limestone. Aragonite, the mineral of cave formations, growing inside decade-old concrete impressions in a residential basement wall, feeding on the moisture that had been weeping from the channels since we opened the wall, flourishing most intensely at the deepest points of each depression, the heel strikes, the moments of maximum downward pressure. The mineral growth only accelerated when the humidity was above 60%, when the slapping sound was at its loudest, when whatever was moving inside that wall was most active. Living geology, stone responding to something that moved through it, the way limestone responds to water over centuries, shaped, channeled, redirected. The difference was that limestone takes centuries to shape, and the concrete in that wall was 80 years at most. The aragonite inside those heel strikes was growing in real time. I went back to the basement that night alone after Owen had gone to bed. The humidity was at 63%. The slapping had been continuous for 4 hours. I sat on the floor beside the exposed wall cavity with the thermal camera in my lap and looked at the silhouette, closer now, its cold edge pressing against the remaining interior stone. 11 footfalls on the floor. 2 displaced channels in the wall core, a limestone vein running northeast beneath the foundation like an ancient road, aragonite crystals blooming in the heel depressions like frost flowers on a winter window, and the slow, heavy knock, the secondary sound beneath the slapping gate, now occurring every third primary beat instead of every fifth. Whatever it was not wandering, it was not confused, it was moving on a path it had always known, toward a surface it had been pressing against for longer than the house had existed. The concrete had not stopped it. It had preserved its passage, immortalized the geometry of its motion the way amber preserves an insect, the way limestone preserves a shell. The prints in the floor were not evidence of entry. I sat with that thought until the thermal camera battery died and the basement went fully dark. They were evidence of approach, of something that had been moving toward this surface for a long time and had not yet reached it. I called Dr. Varden at midnight. "The last section of the wall," I said. "Is there any reason structurally we couldn't remove it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Structurally, no, the limestone would take the load." "And the sealed cavity the blueprints don't account for?" Another pause, longer. "I've been thinking about that since I left. The original construction crew filled that quarry pit, but they found something in the limestone when they were doing it. There's a note in the 1943 contractor's log. I didn't mention it earlier because I wasn't sure it was relevant. Tell me now." "The foreman wrote that they sealed off a section of the quarry face because one of the workers refused to enter it, said it wasn't safe, but the structural engineer signed off on the fill anyway." A breath. "The worker's exact words as the foreman recorded them were that the section made a noise like someone walking toward you from very far away." "Very far away," I repeated. "Or very far down," Dr. Varden said carefully. We removed the last structural block on a Thursday morning, with the humidity at 64% and rising. I had brought in additional monitoring equipment overnight, a second LiDAR unit pointed at the exposed wall cavity to track any surface changes in real time, a calibrated seismograph to detect vibration in the concrete, and a high-sensitivity audio recorder running a continuous capture at 96 kilohertz, far above the frequency range of human hearing, so that nothing produced in that space would go undocumented. Ray Paulus returned. He looked like a man who had decided that whatever was in that wall was no longer his professional problem, but had come back anyway, which I respected. Owen Hartwell stood at the top of the basement stairs again. This time he held a coffee mug in both hands, and I noticed he had not filled it. The final block was 38 centimeters of concrete covering the limestone vein access point. According to Dr. Varden's research, this was the section of the original quarry face that the 1943 construction crew had sealed and refused to excavate further. The block's inner face should, if our geometry was correct, border the edge of the void that the blueprints had never acknowledged, the narrow vertical cavity that showed on our acoustic triangulation as a column of anomalous space approximately 40 centimeters wide and extending downward beyond the range of our equipment. Ray made his cuts. The block came free. He set it aside. For a moment, nothing. The exposed cavity was narrow and dark, running vertically into the limestone below the concrete foundation line. The air that moved out of it was cold, measurably cold, the thermal camera reading a 5-degree drop in the surrounding basement air within seconds of the opening. The mineral smell intensified, petrichor and limestone and something underneath both that I could not name and did not want to. The seismograph registered the first vibration at 10:04 in the morning. not a sound, a physical tremor in the concrete, measured in microns, too small to feel with a hand pressed against the surface, but unmistakable on the instrument readout. The vibration pattern was rhythmic, one heavy pulse, 72 centimeters of propagation distance through the concrete substrate, then another. The seismograph was drawing a waveform that matched, point for point, the acoustic record we had built over the previous 5 days. The walking gait, the stride, the same geometry, now expressed not as sound, but as seismic energy moving through the foundation. Something was walking, and the vibration was getting stronger. I ran the LiDAR unit across the exposed cavity face, the point cloud rendered in real time, and I watched the display with the particular focus of a person who has stopped being afraid of the data and is simply trying to understand it before the moment passes. The cavity's inner walls were limestone, raw and unfinished, the original quarry face exactly as the 1943 workers had left it. The surface was wet, sheened with the same aragonite-laden water we had found in the concrete channels, and the surface was not smooth. It was covered in impressions, barefoot impressions, sunk into the limestone with the same depth and biological precision as the ones in the concrete floor, the ones in the concrete aggregate. Dozens of them, overlapping, layered, some worn to near illegibility by what must have been countless repetitions of the same passage across the same surface. Not a record of one event, a record of continuous, repeated motion across decades or longer. The same path, walked over and over, pressing ever deeper into the stone with each iteration. The path ran upward, from the base of the cavity, which extended beyond our lighting into the darkness below, ascending the quarry face towards the concrete foundation line, towards the basement, towards the floor, towards the wall, towards us. I stood at the edge of the opening and looked down into the darkness below the cavity floor, where our lights couldn't reach, and the seismograph on the table behind me registered the walking rhythm at its highest amplitude yet. The secondary knock that I first detected 3 days ago, the low percussion that moved through the chest rather than the ears, was now occurring on every primary beat, no longer occasional, constant, a continuous, doubled rhythm, the light step of a bare foot, and beneath it, heavy, patient, the knock of something that had been doing this for longer than concrete existed, longer than limestone quarries existed, longer than any human measurement of time applied to whatever was moving through the dark below. The thermal camera picked up the cold signature at the base of the cavity, rising. The silhouette we had tracked through layers of concrete now showed fully in the open air of the exposed space, rising from the darkness below the limestone line at a speed consistent with a walking pace. 7 degrees colder than the surrounding rock, human in outline, moving with no urgency and no hesitation whatsoever. Owen Hartwell said something from the top of the stairs. I didn't hear the words. I was watching the thermal display. The cold shape reached the foundation line. It did not pause at the edge of the concrete. It moved through the concrete, the way the prints in the aggregate showed it always had, without friction, without resistance, the stone simply accommodating its passage. The temperature differential spread into the basement air as the shape crossed into the room, and for approximately 4 seconds, I felt the air around me drop. Not a chill, a depth, as if the room had briefly extended downward by several stories, and I was standing at the edge of that extension. Then the humidity sensor peaked at 67%. The slapping sound reached its highest recorded amplitude. The seismograph drew a single enormous spike across its readout and stopped. The rhythm stopped. The secondary knock stopped. The thermal differential in the air dispersed in under 10 seconds, the temperature returning to baseline as if a door had been closed. The mineral smell faded slowly over the following hour until the basement smelled only of cut concrete and dust. I stood in the silence for a long time. The LiDAR unit, still running, completed its sweep of the cavity interior and rendered the point cloud on my laptop screen. The limestone impressions were still there, every one of them, every layered repetition, every generation of passage preserved in the rock face. The uppermost set of impressions, the most recent, ended at the foundation line, where the limestone met the concrete. Beyond that point, in the concrete itself, the aggregate displacement channels we had exposed ran upward and outward, through the wall, into the basement. And on the basement floor, the LiDAR point cloud showed 11 footprint impressions, exactly as before. The same geometry, the same stride length, the same anatomical precision. But the 11th impression, the last one before the wall, the mid-step print that had always read as incomplete, weight still transferring forward, was different now. The LiDAR showed the heel of the 11th print fully planted, weight fully committed, the step completed. Not entering, not trying to enter. The step was already done. Had been done, possibly, the moment the cavity was opened, the moment the final concrete boundary was removed, the moment whatever had been pressing against the threshold from below finally found nothing left to press against. I thought about what I had told myself from the beginning, that the prints led into the wall, that something had come in, that we were tracing the evidence of passage from outside to inside, from the world to whatever lay beneath it. I had been reading the geometry backwards. Every instrument, every data point, every piece of evidence we had accumulated over 5 days told the same story when I finally turned it the right way around. The prints did not lead into the basement wall. They led out of it. Something had been walking upward through limestone for a very long time, something patient, rhythmic, relentless, following the vein of stone the way water follows gravity, not because it hurries, but because it cannot do otherwise. It had reached the concrete foundation and it had pressed against it for decades, leaving its geometry in the aggregate, leaving its acoustics in the stone, leaving the biological record of its passage in the cold silhouette on the thermal display. And now the concrete was open. I packed my equipment slowly. Ray Paulus said nothing as he carried his saw up the basement stairs. Owen Hartwell met me in the living room and looked at my face and did not ask me what I had found, which told me that somewhere in him he had always known. I drove back to my hotel and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the dark. The footprints in the Hartwell basement were not evidence of something that had come in. They were evidence of something that had come through. And the basement now, on a Thursday morning, with the humidity at 67% and the cavity open to whatever lay below, the basement was simply the next room. I do not know what walks below old limestone. I do not know how long it has been walking, or what it moves toward, or whether it registers our presence the way we registered its acoustics, as a faint, rhythmic signal from somewhere above, proof of life in a layer of the world it is slowly, patiently ascending toward.
I know only what the instruments showed, what the stone preserved, what the geometry could not lie about once I read it correctly. Something rose out of the dark below an old quarry in western Pennsylvania. It rose through limestone. It rose through concrete. It rose through 80 years of sealed foundation and emerged into a basement where someone had been listening to its footsteps and waiting without knowing they were waiting for it to arrive. And the footprints on the floor were not a warning. They were a record of completion.